Today we're going to look at what some call the Olivet prophecy. That is a prophecy that was uttered on the Mount of Olives. Others call it the little apocalypse of Mark chapter 13. And Mark chapter 13 is considered in part to be apocalyptic. That is apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is a genre of Jewish religious writings that developed around the end of the Jewish exile in Babylon about 538 BC. This literature generally deals with the author's visions of the end of the age, or the so-called end times. And the writings often use mythical or cosmological imagery and symbols to describe and picture events that will lead up to the end of the age. And the imagery and symbols are left up to the reader to interpret. And thus, as a result, there are many varying interpretations, ideas, and theories about what Mark chapter 13 means. Today we're going to focus on Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 8, and seek to unlock an accurate meaning of these verses and how they relate to our lives today. So let's begin by looking at Mark chapter 13 and verse 1. Mark 13, verse 1. You might remember that Jesus had been in the temple courts teaching. He had observed the widow putting her offering into the temple treasury in the court of women, and now he's leaving the temple court area, leaving the temple grounds. So as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, now notice, this disciple is not named. And I think Mark has mercy on this disciple because the disciple says a rather awkward thing, considering that Jesus has just commented about the poor widow being taken advantage of by the temple system, and has been, ever since his triumphal entry into the city, battling with the corrupt temple system. And yet, here's what this disciple says to him as they leave the temple grounds. Look, teacher, what massive stones! What magnificent buildings! Rather ironic after Jesus has just been condemning and pronouncing judgment on the temple system, for this disciple to look at the massive building that was going on and be excited about it. The second temple, as it was called, was not completed until about 66 AD. So we're here around 30 or so, about 3 decades prior to its completion, but still it was an incredibly beautiful, beautiful building. And in fact, the temple grounds, even at the time of Jesus, comprised 1/6 of the entire city of Jerusalem at that time. Now, when he said in verse 2, do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. I don't care how massive the stones are. Nothing's going to be left standing here. This is all going to be destroyed. Now that was a prophecy really of what was to happen in 70 AD. Not too many decades after the time that Jesus pronounced this. Now, beginning at about 40 AD, a movement began to arise in Judea.
Are you the Judean People's Front? Judean People's Front? Well, the People's Front of Judea. Judean People's Front. Come, wankers. I hate the Romans already. Listen, if you wanted to join the PFJ, you'd have to really hate the Romans. I do. Oh, yeah? How much? A lot. Right, you're in.
And were known as the Zealots. and the Zealots were very anti-Rome. And so things began to turn against the Roman occupation of Palestine, even from that day forward, and tensions had been building. And so the tensions built that in 66 AD, war broke out between the Jewish faction and the Roman legions. And that was indeed a very bloody war. It wasn't finished until 73 AD, when the Romans finally got to the stronghold of Masada, only to find the Jewish refugees there had committed suicide. But from 66 to 73 AD is what's known as the First Jewish War. And this war was incredibly destructive for all of Judea. In fact, in 70 AD, under the armies of Vespasian and Titus, the entire city was destroyed. The temple was ransacked, robbed, looted of all the gold and precious items that were in it. It was burned to the ground, and every stone, miraculously, was overturned. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, 1,100,000 people were slaughtered. Can you imagine that? Because it began about the time of the Feast of Passover and lasted until about our month of July. But the Roman armies invaded the city, and all these pilgrims were there, not just the inhabitants, but all pilgrims from all over. Jewish folk had come to keep the Feast of Passover in the city of Jerusalem and at the temple. So Josephus' figures may be exaggerated, but he says 1,100,000 Jews were slaughtered by the Roman armies. In fact, he says that the fighting took place on top of the dead bodies, that layers of dead bodies went down, and the people fought over the top of them. He goes on to say that hundreds of thousands of young Jewish men in particular were taken captive as slaves. This was the entire destruction of the temple, the city of Jerusalem, and a massacre of many of the faithful Jewish people of the day. It was a horrible thing, and yet Jesus had prophesied that it would indeed happen and that the temple would be destroyed. Now, with the destruction of the temple, that was kind of the end of what had been the Jewish religion of the day. Now, it would carry on eventually in the synagogues with rabbis, but the place where God dwelt, the place where God was with his people, the place where people came from all over the world to worship, gone. Utterly destroyed. And Jesus had already said this with his triumphal entry, with his battle with the scribes, with his condemnation of them for the way they treated the poor widow, for the misuse and abuse of the system as it had come to be around the temple. And he said, you think this temple is beautiful? And it was considered one of the most beautiful and outstanding buildings on earth in its day. In fact, it was built out of beautiful white marble. And as you approach the city of Jerusalem, you could see it gleaming white in the sun. It was up on a hill. And it was decorated with gold. And now it's utterly and completely destroyed by 70 AD. And Jesus said it's going to happen. So they continue from the temple courts down across the Kidron Valley and back up to the Mount of Olives, which was the place where Jesus and his disciples, and indeed other Galileans, frequently met during the festival seasons. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, so if you can imagine the scene, this gleaming white, beautiful temple, white marble sitting upon the holy hill in Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley in between, and then the Mount of Olives rising up. They were gazing, perhaps even as the sun set behind the temple in the west, across the Kidron Valley at this beautiful, gleaming monument. And so as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John asked him privately. Now, they were very discreet about this. Why? Well, for one thing, if you started talking about the destruction of the temple at this time, that was insurrection. Insurrection against the Jewish religious leadership. an insurrection against the Roman officials. So, I can't believe what you said, Jesus. Just among us, what are you talking about? What's going to happen? This is shocking. This is unbelievable. Please explain what you mean. So Peter, James, and John ask him privately, tell us, when shall these things happen? When is this going to happen? When is the temple going to be destroyed? We want to know when. Well, people always want to know the future, don't they? I don't know about you, but I'm not so sure I want to know the future. I'm taking it day by day. But people want to know the future. Sometimes they think, well, if I know the future and what's coming, maybe I can avoid it. Maybe I can escape it. Maybe I can do something differently. So please, Jesus, tell me, what's the future going to be like? When will these things be? The destruction of the temple. The end of Judaism as we know it in our era. When is this going to happen? Now they continue, and what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? Now they didn't realize it, but they were really asking two different questions. But they put them together, and Jesus throughout chapter 13 is going to begin to answer those actually two questions separately. But what do they mean? When will these things happen? Now you can read over that very quickly without appreciating the significance of it. These things. These things is a phrase from the Old Testament. And it's particularly found in Daniel chapter 12, verses 7 through 9, where Daniel said that in the end times, in the last days, these things shall happen. And when these things happen, then, so Peter, James, Andrew, and John are thinking perhaps about what Daniel said and realizing that what they have just heard Jesus pronounce is the end of the world. That's the end of the world. It's the end of the age. It's the end of this present age. And then what's going to happen next? Jesus, we want to know. If the world is going to end, we want to be prepared for it. So please tell us about it. But listen to Jesus' answer in verse 5. Jesus said to them, watch out, beware, take care, take heed, that no one deceives you. Now, he's warning them that it's possible for God's people, if they're not looking out, to be deceived. Deceived about what? Deceived about these things and when they're going to happen. Has anyone ever been deceived about the end of the world and when it was going to happen? Oh, let me think. If you want to have some fun, you can look up this article on Wikipedia. I copied it. 16 pages. 16 pages of the title is List of Dates Predicted for the Apocalyptic Events. In other words, when's the end going to come? Now, I thought you might be interested. I'm just going to highlight a few of these that might be interesting to you, but you're welcome to download it, read it on Wikipedia, the entire 16 or so pages of predictions. Beginning, guess when they begin? 66 AD. What happened in 66 AD? The First Jewish War, culminating in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. And what did people say when that happened? It's the end of the world. It's time for Messiah to come. The Messiah, the Christ, is coming. It's the end of the world. But it wasn't. And then, in the year 1000, now what do you think would happen as you come to that number 1000? 1,000 years, the year 1000. this must be the end of the world. You say, well, how could people believe that? Do you remember what happened in 2000? Called Y2K. It was, again, the end of the world. But it happened in 1000 as well. And then down through history. Some names that you may not know, but some names you might. Here's one name you might know, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, in his book of prophecies in 1501, predicted the world would end in 1656. Well, he wasn't right. So guess what? He predicted it again. He predicted it again. That seems to be a common thread. If once you don't succeed, try predicting the end again. And then, looking at so many here, John Wesley, of all people, John Wesley, attributed to be the founder of the Methodist Church, predicted the end of the world in 1836. Then you may have heard of the Millerites, the followers of William Miller, who predicted the end of the world about 3 or 4 times, particularly in 1843, and then again, when that didn't happen in 1844, you may remember the story. The followers of William Miller all bought white robes, sold their farms, gave up their businesses, and went out on the hillside to wait for Jesus. And he didn't show. So what did they do? They set another date. And it didn't happen again. Now, what's interesting about William Miller is out of his followers emerged what was called the Adventist movement, and some groups you may have heard of, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Church of God Seventh Day, and the Worldwide Church of God, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. All emerged out of that, and they all had one thing in common. They kept setting dates for the return of Christ and the end of the world. So there was William Miller, and then there was Jonas Wendell, who was a follower of the Millerites. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. He predicted that Christ would come in 1873 to 1874, and when he didn't show up, the Adventists adopted that he really did come, it was just invisible, and no one saw it. Okay. In 1914, Charles Taze Russell, attributed to one of the founding people of the what would come to be called the Jehovah's Witnesses, predicted that Jesus would come in 1914. After all, World War I. This must be the end. This is the end of the age. These are the end times that we're living in. Then a name you might recognize, in 1836, a radio preacher by the name of Herbert W. Armstrong predicted that Jesus was coming. And as World War II developed, Herbert Armstrong predicted that Mussolini and his armies and Hitler and his armies would fight Jesus Christ and his angels as he returned to the earth. Didn't happen. So what happens? Do you give up? You say, well, I must have this wrong. No, you set another date. 1941, Jehovah's Witnesses, again, predicted the end of the world. 1943, Herbert Armstrong predicted it again. 1951, Herbert Armstrong on a radio broadcast said, and I have a copy of that radio broadcast, he said, a great famine is going to grip this world this year, 1951, and it's going to bring this nation to its knees, and a united Europe will invade us, overthrow us, take us captive, and Christ will return. It is the end of the world. And he said, now, if I'm wrong, you know what the Bible says you ought to do with false prophets. Stone them to death. So I guess I've stuck my neck out here. But thankfully, it wasn't the end of the world. Christ didn't come. There was no famine. And Herbert Armstrong did not get stoned to death. Those are all kind of good things that happen. So, Then in 1972, Herbert Armstrong predicted that the true church would flee to, or some people call it rapture, but flee to a place of safety, possibly Petra in the Middle East. Didn't happen. In 1975, Herbert Armstrong prophesied that Christ would return and it was the end of the world. Didn't happen. He wasn't alone. The Jehovah's Witnesses predicted Christ would return and the end of the world in 1975. They weren't alone. Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth, predicted Jesus would return in 1975, and it was the end of the world. It didn't happen. So Hal Lindsey said, well, let's count the 7 years of Nebuchadnezzar and make it 1982 will be the end of the world, and Christ will return. Didn't happen. So Chuck Smith, the founder of Calvary Chapel, predicted the world would end in 1981. Pat Robertson, on his 700 Club TV show, predicted that the end of the world would come in 1982. Didn't happen. Louis Farrakhan. Maybe you didn't realize this, but the leader of the Nation of Islam declared that the Gulf War was Armageddon, and it was the end of the world. In 1994, you may have heard this name, Harold Camping, radio preacher, predicted that the rapture would occur. Didn't. When it didn't happen, he revised his date. Then in 1995, he revised the date again. And then later, he revised the date again. Until finally, as far as I know, he gave up. Jerry Falwell predicted in the year 2000, January 1st, that God was making judgment on the world on that day. And then, of course, as I said, the year 1000, Tim LaHaye, left behind, secret rapture. Tim LaHaye stated that the Y2K bug in the year 2000 would trigger, guess what? The end of the world. And so did a lot of other people. And on it goes. 2006, Yisrael Hawkins, pastor of the House of Yahweh, and you may not know that, but that came out of the Adventist movement, out of the Church of God Seventh Day, the same family as the Worldwide Church of God. Yisrael Hawkins predicted Christ would return in 2006. Didn't happen. End of the world. Pat Robertson, in his book, The New Millennium, suggests that the date of the Earth's destruction would be April 29th, 2007. Didn't happen. Oh, Harold Camping came back for his last try, May 21st, 2011, and that's the last we heard. Then, in September 29th, 2011, a pastor by the name of Ron Wineland, a former pastor of the Worldwide Church of God, predicted the end of the world. It didn't happen. So on May 27th in 2012, he predicted it again. Didn't happen. And on it goes for 16 pages, beginning in 64 AD and going up to today and into the future. So what do we conclude? Take heed that no one deceives you. True words, right? Take heed that no one deceives you. Verse 6, Mark 13. Many, 16 pages worth, for many will come in my name, my authority, claiming I am he, claiming either they are the Messiah, and will deceive many. So here's what Jesus says in verse 7. When you hear of wars and rumors or noises of war, what should you do? Panic! Set a date! It's the end of the world! What did Jesus say? When you hear wars, do not be alarmed. Don't be misled by thinking you can watch world events and figure out the end of the world? History proves you can't. Jesus said you can't. So don't be alarmed. Why? For such things must happen. Such things are bound to happen. That's history, folks. That's the way it's going to be. That's the way this human existence is. These things, when you hear all this stuff, given fallen human nature, these things are bound to happen. But don't be alarmed. These things are bound to happen, but what? But what? The end is still to come. Now, did he mean the end of the temple or the end of the age or the end of the world? Maybe all. But the end has not come. It didn't come in 70 AD, even though it looked like it. To all the people who believed and worshiped God, it looked like it. But it didn't. And it hasn't yet. But the end is still to come. For nation will rise in arms against nation and kingdom against kingdom. It's going to happen. There will be earthquakes in various places, and there were leading up to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. You might have heard of one, Pompeii, Laodicea. There was a famine in Judea. Remember the book of Acts and the Apostle Paul raising a collection for the hungry folk in Jerusalem and in Judea. Nation will rise in arms against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. The beginning of birth pains. All right. Some of us in this room have had children and have had birth pains. Some of us have not. But some of us have been witness to birth pains. So what do you do when you first experience a birth pain? Rush to the hospital, quick! After a while, if it's your first child, maybe you think that, but after a while you go, nah, not yet. Not yet, not time yet. Wait, be patient, just see what happens. Jesus said this is the beginning of birth pains. Guess what? There will be many, many more before the end comes. Don't go to the hospital yet. All right. So what do we learn from our pericope today? Mark 13, verses 1 through 8. Well, for the Jewish people, especially those living in Judea, the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD was the end of the world. It was the end of the age as far as they were concerned. The center of their religious devotion and worship was no more. The building that symbolized God's presence with the Jewish people was no more. It was the end. It was the end for the chief priests. Gone. It was the end for the Sadducees. No temple, no chief priests, no Sadducees. And the scribes who lived in Jerusalem, no longer needed. All gone. Disappeared. That was it. All over. It sure looked like the end of the world. And it was likely that it was during this time, hear me church, likely 66 to 70 AD that Mark was writing this gospel for Christians in Rome. The Christians in Rome at that time were being harassed and persecuted for being Christians. They were being persecuted for their faith, and while they're being persecuted, harassed, and some even executed for their faith, all this is going on in Palestine and in Jerusalem. What would you think as a Christian? I would think it's the end of the world. I would think this is the end. And so, do you think that Mark telling them this story of what Jesus said would be helpful? Oh, absolutely. Mark's recounting of the words of Jesus on the Mount of Olives brought comfort and reassurance to the Christians in Rome during this time of precarious situation. But what about us as Christians today? Well, what we read here is a warning. It's a warning not to let anyone deceive you or lead you astray, because it's possible. I don't know if any of you have believed it would be the end of the world before. I have. I was deceived. It's easy to be deceived about that. You know why? Because you want it to be. You really kind of want this present evil world to end, and you kind of want to see it all over, and so you hope. But don't be deceived. This is a warning from Jesus against hasty assumptions about what's going on in the world around us. I don't know how many times I've heard, since I've been alive, well, one president election after another, well, this is it. Well, with this president, we're doomed. I don't know of a president I haven't heard that about yet. But it hasn't happened. So don't make hasty assumptions about what's going on in the world around you. Jesus warned us. Don't allow people or events to divert you from your mission of making disciples and of living and sharing the gospel. You know what some say? We got to get out of here. We need to find a place where it's safe. Let's leave the world and get out of here and go off by ourselves and be alone where we'll be safe. What about your neighbors? What about other people? Is there no sharing of Jesus and the gospel with them? It's save your own hide? I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. I know it isn't. So don't allow people or events to divert you from living and sharing the gospel and making disciples. Don't go off somewhere to withdraw from or hide from the world. Don't focus on the end of the world. Focus on the world around you now and how much it needs Jesus and how it needs the gospel and how it needs our participation in the ongoing ministry of Jesus Christ to share Jesus and to share the gospel with other people instead of worrying about ourselves. We are warned by Jesus that lots of bad stuff will happen before the end comes and Christ returns in glory. But guess what? But even when all this bad stuff happens, the end is not yet. However, our end could come at any time. It may be yours or my last days. We don't know that. The end could come at any time, even when we least expect it. So what do? We must be ready always. That's Mark 13 says, watch, take heed, beware. Several times Jesus says, watch. Watch what? Watch your life. We don't know when the world is going to end. We don't even know when we're going to end, but we know it will come. Therefore, we need to live every day knowing that the end for each of us is indeed coming. But don't be worried. Don't be consumed, preoccupied, or upset about the world around you. We need to trust, have faith. Trust that no matter what happens in the world around us, who's in charge? God's in charge. He's not letting the world get out of control. God's in charge. God is in control. When will the final end come? I've got an answer for you. Here's the answer. I don't know.
I'll tell you. I don't know.
When will your end come? When will my end come? I don't know. We don't need to know. We don't need to know the future to be saved. We need to know the one who holds the future in his hands. Trust in him. Have faith in him. No matter how bad things ever appear, all is going to end well. Wow, doesn't that give you hope and encouragement? God has the whole world in his hands, and everything, trust him, will work out for the best. And that is a great and happy ending. The end of the world is not something to be afraid of, or fear, or worry, or be preoccupied about, because when it all ends, all will be well. I've read the book. It's called the Bible. And you know what? It has a happy ending. And that's the thing to remember. So that's a great and a happy and a wonderful ending. And you know what else? That's a good ending for this sermon.